$38,000 destroyed my family in one night. And you know what? Today I'm going to tell you how I spent twice that amount to bring them back after 15 years of silence. If you're ready to hear a story about how pride can steal the most precious thing you have, hit subscribe right now. What happened next changed my life forever. Hello there, dear ones. My name is Martha, and I'm 73 years old now. I'm sitting here in my small kitchen with a cup of chamomile tea, looking out at my garden where the evening primroses are just beginning to bloom. If you're new to our channel, please hit that subscribe button right now, because what I'm about to share with you might just change how you think about family, money, and forgiveness forever. You see, 27 years ago, I watched my parents' marriage crumble over debt that seemed insurmountable at the time, $38,000. That was more money than most families saw in 3 years back in 1998. I was 26 then, fresh out of college with my teaching degree, living in a cramped apartment in downtown Syracuse, thinking I knew everything about life and how it should work. I had no idea that within 6 months my daddy would be living in a one-room efficiency above Murphy's hardware store. I had no idea that my mama would be working double shifts at the textile mill just to keep the lights on in our family home. Most of all, I had no idea that harsh words spoken in desperation would create a wall of silence that would last 15 long years. 15 years where Christmas cards went unopened, where birthdays passed without a phone call, where my own children would grow up not knowing their grandparents' voices or their stories. But before we descend into that dark valley, let me paint you a picture of what our family used to be like. If you're finding value in this story already, please give it a thumbs up. It helps other people find these important stories too, and trust me, someone in your life needs to hear what happened next. Our house on Maple Street was the kind of place where neighbours knew they could always find fresh coffee and a listening ear. The yellow kitchen curtains were always pulled back to let in the morning light, and the front porch swing was never empty for long. Daddy worked at the General Electric plant for 31 years. He started right after he came back from Vietnam in 1969, young and determined to build something solid for his family. Every morning at 5:30 sharp, I'd hear his work boots on the wooden kitchen floor, the gentle clink of his coffee spoon against that blue ceramic mug Mama had given him for their first anniversary. He'd sit at the kitchen table for exactly 15 minutes, reading yesterday's paper and planning his day, before kissing Mama goodbye and heading out to face whatever challenges the factory would throw at him. Mama was the beating heart of our neighbourhood. She ran a small catering business from our kitchen. Nothing fancy, mind you, just good honest food for church socials, funeral luncheons, and the occasional wedding reception. Her apple pies were legendary at St. Mary's Catholic Church, and her beef stew could make a grown man weep with homesickness for a childhood he'd never even had. I remember coming home from school and finding our dining room table covered with cooling racks full of dinner rolls, the whole house smelling like yeast and butter and love made edible. Mama would be humming some old hymn while she worked, her apron dusted with flour, and she'd always have a warm roll waiting for me with honey butter melted just right. Those were the days when our biggest worry was whether the high school football team would make it to state championships. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable in that solid middle-class way that seemed unshakable at the time. Daddy's steady paycheck covered the mortgage and utilities, and Mama's catering money paid for groceries, my school clothes, and the small luxuries that made life sweet. Every Friday night was family night. We'd make homemade pizza with pepperoni arranged in perfect circles and play Scrabble until someone got too competitive and Mama would declare a truce with vanilla ice cream all around. Sunday mornings meant church, followed by the biggest breakfast you ever saw. Pancakes, bacon, scrambled eggs, fresh biscuits and coffee, strong enough to wake the dead. Daddy would read the funny papers out loud, doing different voices for the cartoon characters, while Mama packed up leftover food for Mrs. Peterson next door, whose husband had passed the year before. But in 1996, everything started to shift beneath our feet like sand in an earthquake. General Electric announced they were restructuring. That's the corporate word they use when they want to sound professional about cutting people's lives in half. It sounds so clean and efficient, doesn't it? Restructuring, like they're just rearranging furniture instead of dismantling families piece by piece. Daddy didn't lose his job right away, but the writing was on the wall in letters 10 feet tall. Overtime disappeared first, then the Christmas bonuses got smaller, then the talk around the plant turned to early retirement packages and voluntary buyouts. For the first time in my memory, I heard my parents talking in worried whispers after they thought I'd gone to bed. The catering business started struggling too, though it took me years to understand why. The church was cutting back on social events as their older members passed away or moved to nursing homes. More people were choosing those new chain restaurants for their family celebrations instead of trusting Mama's home-cooked meals. The personal touch that had once been her biggest selling point suddenly seemed old-fashioned and unnecessary in a world that was moving faster every day. By 1997, she was lucky to book one catering job a month. I remember her sitting at that same kitchen table where Daddy read his morning paper, going through her recipe box and trying to figure out what she could offer that the big restaurants couldn't. She'd take out her grandmother's recipe for wedding cake, written in faded ink on an index card, and just stare at it like it held the answer to all our problems. That's when the credit cards entered our lives, though I didn't know it at the time. I want you to understand something important here. My parents weren't reckless people. They weren't buying luxury items or taking fancy vacations or living beyond their means for the thrill of it. These were good, hard-working people trying to keep their heads above water while everything familiar and stable around them shifted like quicksand. The first card was just for emergencies. When the washing machine that had faithfully cleaned our clothes for 12 years finally gave up and died, they put the repair on credit rather than dip into their small savings account. When Daddy's car needed new brakes and the mechanic's bill came to $400, that went on the card too. When I needed textbooks for my final semester of college, books that cost more than Mama made in a week of catering, they insisted on paying. I didn't know until years later that those textbooks went on the credit card as well. One card became 2 when the first one reached its limit. 2 became 4 when unexpected expenses kept coming. The water heater, the roof repairs after the bad storm in March, my graduation expenses, including the dress and shoes and dinner celebration that I thought were just normal parts of reaching such an important milestone. The minimum payments grew slowly at first, like a leak that starts with a drip and gradually becomes a steady stream. $50 a month became $100, then $200, then $400. Interest rates that had seemed reasonable at 12% suddenly jumped to 18%, then 21%, then 26%. It was like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom that kept getting bigger no matter how fast you poured water into it. Meanwhile, I was so wrapped up in my own life that I missed all the warning signs. I was student teaching at the elementary school, going on job interviews, planning my future with David, the young man I was dating who seemed like everything I wanted in a husband. I was living in that apartment downtown, learning to cook for myself and pay my own bills, feeling so adult and independent and wise. Sure, I noticed little changes when I visited home. The name-brand cereal in their kitchen cupboards got replaced with store brands. Mama's weekly hair appointments became monthly, then every other month. Daddy started buying his work shirts at the thrift store instead of Sears, claiming the old ones wore better anyway. But these seemed like minor adjustments, the kind of small economies that sensible people make when they want to save a little money. They hid the worst of it from me, with the skill that only parents possess. Parents will go without heat before they'll let their children worry. They'll eat peanut butter sandwiches for dinner and tell you they're trying to eat lighter when you call to check on them. They'll wear the same winter coat for 5 years and claim it's because they really like that particular style. Looking back now, I can see a dozen signs I should have noticed. The way Mama's hands shook slightly when she wrote checks at the grocery store. The way Daddy's shoulders seemed to carry invisible weight every time he walked through the front door. The way their conversation stopped abruptly when I entered a room, followed by bright, false smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. But I was 26 and in love, and convinced that my parents were as solid and permanent as the mountains. They'd always figured things out before. They'd always taken care of me and each other and everyone around them. It never occurred to me that they might be drowning in plain sight, smiling and waving while the water rose over their heads. The explosion came on March 15th, 1998. I remember the exact date because it was the Ides of March, and my high school English teacher had always made a big deal about Shakespeare and the ominous nature of that date. Sometimes life has a dark sense of humour, doesn't it? I had driven over for Sunday dinner, which had become a weekly tradition since I'd moved out. The moment I walked through that familiar front door, I knew something was different. The house felt wrong, too quiet, too tense, like the air itself was holding its breath. Mama was at the stove, stirring gravy with mechanical precision, but her usual cheerful chatter was nowhere to be found. No humming, no commentary about the neighbours or questions about my week. Just the scrape of the spoon against the pan, and a silence that felt heavy enough to press against my chest. Daddy was sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread in front of him like battle plans. Bills, statements, letters with angry red print that seemed to scream from the white paper. His reading glasses were perched on the end of his nose, and his face had that defeated look that I'd never seen before and never wanted to see again. "How bad is it?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. Daddy looked up at me, and I saw something in his blue eyes that I'd never seen in 30 years of being his daughter. Complete, bone-deep defeat. The kind of defeat that comes not from losing a battle, but from discovering that you've been fighting the wrong war all along. $38,642, he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "That's what we owe on the cards. The house payment is 3 months behind. They're talking about foreclosure, Martha. They want to take our home." The wooden spoon in Mama's hand cracked against the stove with a sound like a gunshot. She whirled around, her face flushed with anger and something that looked like betrayal. "Don't you dare put this all on the credit cards, Richard. Don't you dare stand there and pretend your gambling didn't contribute to this mess." Gambling. The word hit that kitchen like a physical blow. I actually took a step backward, my hand reaching for the doorframe to steady myself. "It wasn't gambling," Daddy said, but his voice lacked conviction. He sounded like a man trying to convince himself of a lie he'd been telling for months. "It was investing. Jerry at work had this system for the lottery numbers, based on statistical analysis of previous drawings." "Statistical analysis?" Mama's voice rose to a pitch I'd never heard from her. "You spent $300 a month for 8 months buying lottery tickets based on some fool system. That's $2,400, Richard. $2,400 we didn't have to begin with." What followed was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed between my parents. 30 years of marriage, and I'd never heard them raise their voices to each other. They'd always been the couple that other people looked at with envy, the ones who seemed to have figured out how to love each other through everything life could throw at them. But that day, 27 years of carefully maintained respect and partnership crumbled like old mortar in an earthquake. Accusations flew like weapons designed to cause maximum damage. Mama brought up every financial mistake Daddy had ever made, going back to a boat he'd bought and sold at a loss in 1982. Daddy threw back every catering job she'd lost, every client who'd complained, every burnt cake that had to be remade at their own expense. They fought about money, but they were really fighting about trust, about secrets, about the slow erosion of everything they'd built together, eaten away by shame and fear and the desperate need to pretend that everything was still okay when it clearly wasn't. And then Mama said the words that changed everything forever. "I can't do this anymore, Richard. I can't keep pretending we're going to get through this together when you keep lying to me about where our money goes. I can't live with someone I don't trust anymore." The silence that followed those words was deafening. I stood there in that kitchen where I'd eaten thousands of meals, where I'd done homework and shared secrets and announced my college acceptance, and I watched my family disintegrate in real time. That's where we'll pause this story, dear ones. In the next part, I'll tell you about the divorce that followed, the 15 years of silence that nearly destroyed us all, and the phone call that changed everything. If this story is touching your heart, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Sometimes we all need reminding that it's never too late to come home. The divorce papers were filed 6 weeks later, not because they stopped loving each other, though it took me years to understand that. They divorced because the stress and shame and blame had poisoned something that had once been beautiful. The debt wasn't just numbers on paper anymore. It was a cancer that ate away at their trust, their communication, their ability to see each other as partners instead of adversaries in a war they were both losing. I watched from the sidelines as my childhood home went into foreclosure 3 months after that terrible Sunday dinner. 30 years of memories packed into boxes and sold at a garage sale that broke my heart. The kitchen table where we'd played Scrabble, the couch where Daddy had read me bedtime stories, the garden where Mama had taught me to grow tomatoes. All of it reduced to price tags and handed over to strangers who had no idea what they were really buying. Mama moved into a cramped apartment on the other side of town and picked up a second job cleaning offices at night. She'd work her catering jobs during the day when she could find them, then head to office buildings at 10 p.m. to empty trash cans and vacuum floors until 3 in the morning. She never complained, never asked for help, never let on that she was slowly killing herself trying to pay off her share of the debt that had destroyed her marriage. Daddy found that efficiency apartment above Murphy's hardware store. 1 room with a hot plate and a mini fridge, and a bathroom he had to share with the tenant next door. He took on weekend work doing handyman repairs for anyone who would hire him, his skilled factory hands learning new trades out of necessity. Plumbing, electrical work, painting houses, anything to make enough money to cover his rent and chip away at the mountain of debt that felt like it was buried him alive. And me, I was so angry at both of them that I couldn't see straight. How dare they destroy our family over money? How dare they give up on 30 years of marriage because of some credit card debt and a stupid lottery ticket habit? I was young and self-righteous and completely blind to the complexity of what they were going through. I told them both that I was disappointed in them. I actually used those exact words standing in that lawyer's office where they were signing the papers that would legally end their marriage. "I'm disappointed in you," I said, like I was the parent and they were children who had misbehaved. "I'm disappointed that you're being selfish and foolish, and if you can't put your family first, then maybe I can't put you first either." The last conversation I had with my father for 15 years ended with him saying, "Someday, Martha, you'll understand that some things can't be fixed with good intentions and wishful thinking." The last conversation I had with my mother ended with her saying, "I hope you never have to choose between your pride and your survival, honey, because you might not like the choice you make." And just like that, at 26 years old, I became an orphan by choice. Not because my parents had died, but because I was too proud and too young and too absolutely certain that I knew better than they did about how life should work. The years that followed were successful ones for me, at least on the surface. I married David in 1999 in a beautiful ceremony that my parents didn't attend. We moved to Albany, where he got a job with the state government, and I found a position teaching 3rd grade at a school that appreciated my dedication and energy. We bought a nice house in the suburbs with a 2-car garage and a backyard perfect for children. Those children came along exactly when we planned. Emily in 2001, a perfect baby girl with blonde curls and her father's gentle temperament. James in 2003, a boy who looked just like my daddy had in old photographs, with the same mischievous smile and curious nature. I threw myself into being the perfect wife, mother and teacher, as if I could build a life so flawless that it would prove I'd been right to cut my parents out of it. But there was always an ache, a hollow space where my parents should have been. Emily's first steps, taken in our living room while I called out encouragement and David captured everything on video. James's first word, which was "Mama," said with such pride and joy that it brought tears to my eyes. Their first days of school, their Christmas morning squeals of delight, their scraped knees and hurt feelings and bedtime stories, all of it celebrated without grandparents. My children would ask why they didn't have a grandpa and grandma like their friends at school. I'd give them vague answers about grown-up problems and difficult situations, explaining that sometimes families couldn't be together, even though they loved each other. Emily accepted this with the trusting nature of a child. James, more persistent, would ask follow-up questions that I deflected with distractions and subject changes. "Did your mommy and daddy die?" he asked one day when he was about 5. "No, sweetheart, they're alive." "Then why can't we see them?" How do you explain pride and stubbornness and 15 years of accumulated hurt to a 5-year-old? How do you admit that you've been wrong about something so fundamental for so long that admitting it feels impossible? I told myself I was protecting my children from toxic family dynamics. I told myself my parents had made their choices and now had to live with the consequences. I told myself that I'd built a better life without them, that we were all happier and healthier without the drama and financial stress they represented. But walls, I learned, are prisons as much as they are fortresses, and after 15 years of imprisoning myself in righteous anger, something happened that would shatter everything I thought I knew about myself and my family. It was October 15th, 2013. I remember the date because it was a Tuesday, and Tuesdays were always my favourite day for grading papers. The house was quiet, David was at work, the kids were at school, and I had a pot of coffee and a stack of third-grade essays about what I want to be when I grow up. Simple dreams written in careful handwriting, a firefighter, a doctor, a teacher like Mrs. Henderson. My phone rang at 2:47 p.m. I almost didn't answer because the number wasn't one I recognised, and telemarketers had become increasingly aggressive. But something made me pick up on the 4th ring. "Is this Martha Henderson?" The voice was unfamiliar, professional, with that careful tone that people use when they're about to deliver news that will change your life. "Yes, this is Martha." "Mrs. Henderson, this is Patricia Walsh from Mercy General Hospital in Syracuse. I'm calling about your father, Richard Kowalski. You're listed as his emergency contact." The world tilted on its axis right there in my kitchen. My father had listed me as his emergency contact. After 15 years of silence, after all the harsh words and burned bridges and stubborn pride, I was still the person he wanted called if something happened to him. "My father, is he... what happened?" "He had a heart attack this morning at work. He's in stable condition now, but Mrs. Henderson, he's been asking for you. He's very insistent that we call you." I sat down hard in my kitchen chair, my hand trembling so badly I nearly dropped the phone. "I'll be right there." The drive to Syracuse took 3 hours, but it felt like 3 days. My mind was racing with questions I couldn't answer and guilt I'd been suppressing for 15 years. How had Daddy looked as he aged? Was he happy? Did he have friends? Had he ever found love again after the divorce? And underneath all those questions was a deeper, more painful one. Why had he kept me listed as his emergency contact when I'd abandoned him so completely? When I walked into that hospital room and saw him lying there, hooked up to machines with wires and tubes, he looked so much smaller than I remembered. His hair had gone completely white, and his face was thinner, marked with lines that spoke of years of worry and loneliness. But his eyes, those blue eyes that had taught me to ride a bicycle and helped me with math homework and twinkled when he told his terrible dad jokes, those eyes were exactly the same. "Martha," he whispered, and his voice broke on my name like it was the most precious word he'd ever spoken. "You came." I couldn't speak for the longest time. I just took his hand, noting how it felt lighter than I remembered, the skin thin and papery, but still warm. We sat there in that sterile hospital room with 15 years of hurt and anger and regret hanging between us like morning fog, both of us afraid to be the first to speak. Finally, I found my voice. "Daddy, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry I stayed away. I'm sorry I was so angry and stubborn and self-righteous. I'm sorry I missed 15 years of your life." He squeezed my hand with more strength than I expected. "Shh, sweetheart, you have nothing to apologize for. I'm the one who should be sorry. Your mother and I, we should have handled things differently. We should have fought for our family instead of fighting each other." Over the next few days, as Daddy recovered slowly but steadily, we talked more than we had since I was a teenager. He told me about his life after the divorce. The loneliness of that efficiency apartment, where the walls were so thin he could hear his neighbour's television until midnight every night. The long hours working maintenance jobs that paid just enough to cover rent and basic expenses and minimum payments on debt that never seemed to shrink. But he also told me about unexpected joys he'd found in the simplest things. The stray cats behind the hardware store that he'd started feeding, naming each one and learning their personalities. The volunteer work he'd begun doing at the food bank on weekends, finding purpose in helping other families avoid the financial disasters that had destroyed his own. The mystery novels he'd discovered at the library, checking out 3 or 4 at a time and losing himself in other people's problems instead of dwelling on his own. I learned to be content with small pleasures, he said, adjusting the hospital blanket around his shoulders. A good cup of coffee in the morning, a cat purring when I scratched behind its ears, the satisfaction of fixing something that was broken and making it work again. And then he asked about Mama. "I haven't spoken to her either, Daddy," I admitted, the shame burning in my chest like acid. "I was angry at both of you." His face fell, and I watched 15 years of hope crumble in real time. "Martha, you need to know something. Your mother never wanted the divorce. I pushed for it because I was so ashamed of what I'd done to our family. The gambling, the lies, the debt. I felt like she deserved better than a man who had failed her so completely." He reached for the water glass on his bedside table with shaking hands. "I thought I was setting her free to find happiness, but I was just being a coward. I was running away from the mess I'd made instead of staying to clean it up." "Where is she now?" I asked, though I was afraid of the answer. "I don't know," he said, and the pain in his voice was almost unbearable. After the divorce was final, she moved out of Syracuse. I heard through mutual friends that she went to stay with her sister Helen in Buffalo, but that was years ago. Martha, I've wanted to find her every single day since then. I've wanted to apologize, to tell her that losing her was the biggest mistake of my life, but I didn't know how to begin." That night, I sat in the hotel room I'd rented near the hospital and made a decision that would change all our lives. I was going to find my mother, and somehow, some way, I was going to try to put our family back together again. The search took 3 weeks of detective work that would have made those mystery novel heroes Daddy loved so much proud. I started with Mama's sister Helen in Buffalo. Helen was surprised to hear from me after so many years, but she was kind and helpful once I explained what had happened. "Your mother moved out about 2 years after she arrived," Helen told me over the phone. "She was too proud to stay dependent on family for long. She found work at a nursing home and got her own little apartment. But that was over 10 years ago, Martha. I haven't heard from her in years." From there, the trail went cold. I called every nursing home in the Buffalo area, but privacy laws meant they couldn't tell me whether she'd worked there or not. I drove to Buffalo on weekends, checking phone books and city directories at the library, walking through neighborhoods where Helen thought she might have lived. It was my 10-year-old son James who suggested the breakthrough. One evening, as I was explaining my frustration over dinner, he said, "Mum, why don't you check with churches? You always said Grandma loved going to church." Out of the mouths of babes, I called every Catholic church in Buffalo, and at St. Anne's on the east side, the secretary's voice changed when I mentioned my mother's name. "Dolores Kowalski?" Oh my goodness, yes, she's one of our most faithful volunteers. She comes in every Tuesday and Thursday to help with the food pantry. Is everything all right? Has something happened? I found her on a Thursday morning in November, sorting canned goods in the church basement. She was wearing a navy blue cardigan that I remembered from years ago, her hair silver now instead of brown, pulled back in the same neat bun she'd always favoured. She looked smaller than I remembered, but her movements were still quick and efficient as she organised donations into categories for families in need. I stood in the doorway for a full minute, just watching her work, trying to find the courage to speak. Finally, I cleared my throat softly. She turned around, and when she saw me, the can of soup in her hand slipped and hit the concrete floor with a sharp clang that echoed through the basement. "Martha," she whispered. "Hello, Mama." We fell into each other's arms right there among the food pantry boxes, both of us crying like children who had been lost and finally found their way home. 15 years of separation, 15 years of missed holidays and grandchildren's hugs and mother-daughter phone calls, all condensed into that one desperate embrace. "I'm sorry," we both kept saying. "I'm so sorry." Over coffee at a diner near the church, Mama told me about her life since the divorce. She'd worked 3 jobs to pay off her share of the debt: the night shift at the nursing home, morning housekeeping at a hotel, and weekend catering for small events when she could find them. It took her 7 years to pay off her portion of those credit card balances, but she'd done it through sheer determination and 18-hour workdays. "I couldn't stand the thought of owing money," she said, stirring sugar into her coffee with hands that shook slightly from years of hard work. Every month I'd send those minimum payments and watch the balance barely budge. It felt like drowning in slow motion. She'd never remarried, never even dated. When I asked her why, she gave me an answer that broke my heart and started to heal it at the same time. "Your father was the love of my life," she said simply. I know we couldn't make it work under those circumstances, but that doesn't mean I stopped loving him. When I told her about Daddy's heart attack, about finding him in the hospital, about his regret over the divorce and his desperate wish to find her, she went very still. For a long moment she just stared into her coffee cup as if it held all the answers to 15 years of questions. "How is he?" she asked quietly. "He's recovering, but Mama, he's alone. He's been alone for 15 years, living in that tiny apartment, working jobs that barely pay the bills. And he told me that losing you was the biggest mistake of his life." Tears started rolling down her cheeks, and she wiped them away with the paper napkin from the diner table. I've driven past that hardware store so many times over the years. I knew he lived upstairs. I'd sit in my car across the street, hoping to catch a glimpse of him, but never having the courage to get out and knock on his door. "Mama, what if we could fix this? What if it's not too late?" She shook her head, but I could see hope fighting with fear in her eyes. "Honey, too much has happened. We're different people now, and the money problems, they haven't gone away. Richard is 68 years old, working maintenance jobs with a bad heart. I'm cleaning hotel rooms at 65. We're both barely getting by on Social Security and part-time work." "What if the money wasn't a problem anymore?" I asked. She looked at me strangely. "What do you mean?" And that's when I told her about David's promotion, about the life insurance policy from his father that had matured, about the savings we'd accumulated over 15 years of careful living and good financial decisions. We weren't wealthy, but we had enough, more than enough to change everything. "Mama, what if I could pay off all the remaining debts? What if I could make sure you and Daddy could retire with dignity? Would you be willing to at least talk to him?" The reunion I orchestrated was the hardest and most beautiful thing I'd ever done. I arranged to meet Daddy at a small coffee shop in Syracuse on a Saturday afternoon in December, just 3 weeks before Christmas. I didn't tell him that Mama was coming because I was afraid he might have another heart attack from the shock. He was already seated at a corner table when I arrived, wearing his best shirt and tie, his thin hair carefully combed. He stood up when he saw me, smiling that same gentle smile I remembered from childhood, the one that had always made me feel safe and loved no matter what kind of day I'd had. "Hi, sweetheart," he said, kissing my cheek. "You look beautiful." "Thank you, Daddy. I'm expecting someone else to join us, if that's okay." He nodded, settling back into his chair. "Of course. David? The grandchildren?" "Someone else," I said, and my heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. When Mama walked through that coffee shop door, Daddy's face went through so many emotions I couldn't keep track. Shock, disbelief, hope, fear, love, regret, all cycling through in the space of seconds. He started to stand up, then sat back down, then stood again. "Dolores," he said, and her name came out like a prayer he'd been saying silently for 15 years. "Hello, Richard." They sat across from each other in that little coffee shop, two people in their late 60s who had loved each other for 30 years, lost each other for 15, and were now face to face again with all of life's wreckage and wisdom between them. The conversation was tentative at first, like two people learning a language they'd once spoken fluently. Questions about health, about work, about the years that had passed. But gradually, as I watched from my place at the table, I saw them beginning to rediscover each other. And slowly, carefully, they began to talk about the divorce, about the debt, about the mistakes they'd both made, and the lessons they'd learned in the years since. "I should never have pushed for the divorce," Daddy said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was a coward, Dolores. I was so ashamed of what I'd done to us financially that I thought you'd be better off without me." "I should have fought harder for us," Mama replied. "I should have insisted we work through it together instead of letting my anger drive us apart." They talked for 3 hours while I mostly listened, watching 15 years of separation begin to heal one conversation at a time. And somewhere in those 3 hours I realized that the greatest gift I could give them wasn't just bringing them together again. It was making sure that money would never tear them apart again. On Christmas Eve of 2013, I paid off every cent of debt that remained from their financial disaster. $47,000 in credit card balances, back taxes and medical bills. It was a significant amount of money for David and me, but it wouldn't bankrupt us. More importantly, it would give my parents the freedom to start over without the crushing weight of debt that had destroyed their marriage the first time. But here's what I learned, dear ones. The money was just the beginning. The real work was rebuilding trust, relearning how to be a family, and helping two people who had never stopped loving each other find their way back to that love without repeating the mistakes that had driven them apart. They remarried on their 40th wedding anniversary, September 23rd, 2014. Not the 40th anniversary of their first marriage, but the 40th anniversary of the day they'd first promised to love each other forever. It was a small ceremony at St. Mary's, the same church where they'd been married the first time, with Emily and James as witnesses, and me as the one who gave them both away to each other again. Today they're living in a small house that David and I helped them buy. Nothing fancy, just a 2-bedroom ranch with a garden where Mama grows tomatoes and Daddy tends his bird feeders. They're both retired now, volunteering together at the food bank and making up for lost time with their grandchildren. And you know what I learned from all of this? Sometimes the greatest act of love is admitting you were wrong. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can spend money on isn't something you can touch or hold, but the chance to heal what was broken and bring home the people who matter most. If you're listening to this story and thinking about someone you've pushed away in anger, someone you miss but are too proud to call, I want you to know this. It's never too late to come home. It's never too late to swallow your pride and pick up the phone. It's never too late to choose love over being right. Don't wait 15 years like I did. Don't let pride steal the precious time you could be spending with the people who love you most. Some mistakes can be fixed, some hearts can be healed, and sometimes, if you're very lucky, you get a second chance to choose love over everything else that doesn't really matter. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need to hear it, and remember, it's never too late to come home.